God's love comes out of God's holiness. We say God is love. Yes, God is love. That's true. Does His holiness come from His love? Or was He holy, and from His holiness, from His perfection, from His completeness, comes a capacity for God to be able to love? The Old Testament gave a lot of instruction on how we can approach God and what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. And here's something you can do when you go home. Get a coffee, get a cup. And it might be in the dishwasher, might be in the sink, on the bench, might be on the floor by the couch, under the bed, wherever you left it last. Pick it up and say, would I drink out of this? And it might be a bit of coffee stain or sour milk. I ask yourself another question. When I fill the cup up with a drink and offer it to a guest, I've heard a little bit lately the spray that's been tossed around a little bit in the media, but you fake it till you make it. And that covers all sorts of areas in life. And one of the things at the moment that is often related to that is developed properties had that philosophy very much of fake it till you make it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I remember I attended a course on fundraising and what you should do if you're looking for donors and funding for, in this case, a charity. And they asked me the question, what do you drive? I said, I drive a Toyota. And said, well, if you want to raise funds, ditch your Toyota. Get something European. Okay. If you want to raise funds, ditch your jeans. Not going to work. Buy yourself a suit. I thought, oh, come on, that's a bit much. Get yourself a tie. Oh, come on, no. But see, what it was is saying a lot of our modern society is based on building an impression. And what you see is we make all sorts of assumptions by the impressions that we get. But God doesn't work that way. God works on the inside. That's why He got really angry with the Pharisees. He says, you clean the outside of your cup, but the inside of your cup is not clean. Pay more attention to what's inside the cup. If you pay attention to what's inside the cup, then the outside of the cup will be clean. So let's look at God. There are a lot of attributes of God. Why don't you turn to someone beside you and see how many you can come up with? It's There's a second part of that question. I think you'll agree there's quite a few. But the second part of the question, does one attribute of God stand out more than others? If you were to pick out one attribute of God and say that this attribute stands out for whatever reasons more than the other attributes, what would that be? Any suggestions? Yeah, call out loud. Gentle. Okay. Any others? What? Love. Any others? Holiness. Any others? Invisible. Yeah. Any others? But I could say, why did you choose that one? Why did you think of that one? But what I want to pick up on this morning is holiness. That God's love comes out of God's holiness. We say God is love. Yes, God is love. That's true. Does His holiness come from His love? Or was He holy, and from His holiness, from His perfection, from His completeness comes a capacity for God to be able to love? You say, is it more important, or is it more like this attribute of God's holiness is an attribute that holds everything else together? So out of His holiness comes mercy and goodness. Out of His holiness comes kindness. Out of His holiness comes His mercy and His grace. Out of His holiness comes His judgment. Out of His holiness comes the whole being of who He is, because God is holy, that everything that comes from Him comes out of who He is in His holiness. And then you say, well, how can I separate those things? Sometimes we get into trouble. We try to see the things as separate. So take God's attribute in relation to time and space. God is omnipresent. Okay, that means God is everywhere. And the scriptures say, well, is God everywhere? And say, where can I go to hide from God? Can I go to Hades? No. Can I hide under a rock? Does that hide me from God? No. Can I go to Australia? Does that hide me from God? No, it doesn't. You can go anywhere. You can be anywhere. And you cannot be hidden from God because He's everywhere. And then there's God's omnipotent. That's His knowledge. God knows everything. That means that God cannot learn. Because if God could learn, then He would gain new knowledge. But He already knows everything. So God can't learn because He knows everything. And you can't take something away from God. You can't take some knowledge or understanding away from God, because then He wouldn't know everything. So you can't add to His knowledge, and you can't take away from His knowledge. You can't find a space where God is, or where God isn't. And then there's God's power. God's power is sufficient for His sovereignty. If God was lacking in any sort of power, then He wouldn't be all-powerful. God doesn't gain power. God is no more powerful today than He was last week, or He will be next week. He's not short of everything. And this brings up, when we look at those attributes of God, then we put those attributes with another group of attributes, and that's aseity. Anyone know what that means? Oh, that's good. You see, every now and again you've got to drop in a word that people don't know. Right? 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 Aseity, A-S-E-I-T-Y. It means that God has always existed. And God has always existed by himself. Before creation, God existed. Before creation, God existed, and God had need of nothing. Before creation, God was totally self-sufficient. Before creation, God didn't rely on anything outside of himself to keep his life going. He didn't need to plug into something else to keep life. He already had it. He has no needs. God didn't create because he was lonely. If God was lonely, he had a need. He would have a need that we needed to fulfill. God has no needs. He's totally self-sufficient, totally self-sustaining, totally complete in himself. How about immutable? Maybe you know this one. Someone must know it. Immutable, immutable. Unchanging. God is unchanging. And because God was who he was, everything that was contained in God, the whole of life, the whole of purpose, the whole of joy, the whole of relationship, the whole of everything else existed within God. God had need of nothing. So therefore, there was nothing that God needed to be added to him to keep him God or to make him God or to make him a better God. And he doesn't change. You say, well, is that a good thing? Absolutely. Because there's another group of attributes of God that revolve around morality. Before creation, God had established already what was right and what was wrong. It existed. Righteousness existed. Everything existed. And so in creation, we discover God's moral law. And he said, I'll write it down for you to make it plain for you so that you know what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But what is acceptable when he gave Moses the 10 Commandments were the same things that were not acceptable before the creation of the world, before the foundations were laid down. And they will not be acceptable in the days ahead until Jesus Christ comes again. He doesn't change. You ever dealt with a council? Some people here, you tick all the boxes and give them all the information. They say, oh, sorry, there's this other regulation you need to fulfill this, and it means everything you've done doesn't matter because it's got new rules. And God doesn't change. And Malachi says, I, the Lord, do not change. Colossians says, he's the source of all things, the one who originated everything and who sustains everything that exists. Isaiah 45 says, there is no other source of life and no other like him, for I am God and there is no other. He's all-knowing, he's everywhere, he's all-powerful. He's faithful, he's merciful. His righteousness and justice don't change. God is perfection, and his perfection is seen in love and truth, which are with his holiness. Really difficult to understand what God's holiness is without a revelation of who he is. We can understand God's holiness in our head. Holiness means perfection. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing that needs changing. There's nothing that needs updating. He doesn't have to download other information. He's perfect. Absolute perfection. And we can understand that to a degree in our minds. But then there's another level of understanding in our heart and in our spirit where we grasp hold of that full depth of what holiness really is. How do we gain that? It's only as we come in humility and in our weakness before God. We say, God, show me, reveal to me something of your holiness. And as we gain that understanding and in our spirit and in our heart, we discover what it really means to be without fault. And it's really easy to beat yourself up in saying, I'm no good. I do this, I lie, I cheat. I think bad things about other people. I'm supposed to be worshipping, but I'm thinking about how to fix my lawnmower. And I think, how often do you do that? You're in the midst of a beautiful time of worship and the silence, and you say, oh yeah, I know where that O-ring went. I know how that bit fits. I know what I need to do tomorrow on my day off. And how quickly we can alternate between the spiritual and the secular, the carnal, the flesh, and the spiritual. And we realize that if we are exposed and compared to God's righteousness, then we're lacking. And the only way that we can change that is we have a vision or an understanding or a revelation of what God's holiness really is like. Not to condemn us, but to hear what he says, I am holy. I want you to be holy. And if God asks us to do something, it's possible. We can go through life and we can be very kind and merciful to a lot of other people. And sometimes being kind and merciful is a choice that we have, and when God says we must be holy. He said we must be holy. As he says in 1 Peter 1, be holy, because I am holy. And out of that holiness, our love for others changes. Out of that holiness that God builds in us, our mercy towards others changes. Out of God's holiness, the way we see other people changes. Out of God's holiness, the way we worship or change. Father, you've never asked anything of us that's impossible. And I ask, Father, that you give us a deeper understanding of your holiness. And as we understand that, we begin to understand what you're calling us into. And as you call us into a life which is increasing in our holiness, then the things which we say to you and the things which we do for you and the things that we meditate on, the things that we read, the things that we sing, the things that we understand will change. Because we're understanding something in our heart. And as we understand at this level and in this way, our praise and our worship and our adoration and our devotion to you will be different. Our willingness to do what you ask us to do will be different. Our appreciation of everything you have done for us will be different. And as you speak to us of things that are yet to come in relation to the church and the pastorate and our engagement with you in this community for your honour and glory, that will change too, because we are asking and praying and seeking for your will out of an increasing level of holiness and desire to be more like you, and the desire to honour you more in everything that we say and everything that we do. I ask, Father, by your Spirit, reveal to us your holiness.